morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this roundtable discussion on implementing SLOs, the build versus buy debate. My name is Dan Ruby. I'm the VP of Marketing at Noble9, where we've been bombarding you with emails about this webinar, so you probably know what we do. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined, and especially thank our esteemed panel. Go around and introduce everybody. We have Niall Murphy, who is the co-founder and CEO of Stanza. We have Mandy Walls, DevOps advocate at PagerDuty. Troy Koss, who is the director of reliability software engineering at a major financial institution. And Alex Nauta, Noble9's own CTO. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and let's get it kicked off. So the baseline of this whole conversation is that people are realizing more and more that SLOs are not a nice to have. They're not a feature. They're kind of a core requirement for a modern, user-centric reliability strategy. So the discussion then becomes, well, how do we accomplish that? There's a few different ways to do it. You can build your own internally if you've got engineering staff that you can allocate to it. You can hire software like Noble9, a dedicated SLO platform, or you can use potentially like a feature, an SLO feature in one of your existing telemetry pieces of software. But how do you make that decision? How do you decide whether you're going to build it or you're going to buy it? And I'm going to go to Niall first with our opening question, which is, Niall, when you start thinking about implementing SLOs in your organization, what do you really need to consider first in the build versus buy debate?
Yeah, so build versus buy theory, if I can start off with that phrase, kind of rests on a bunch of underlying generic concerns. So first of all, if you're going to build, do you have the capability to build? Like, do you have software engineers in your organization who can tackle this problem? And there's a bunch of nuances, shall I say, very carefully, to the question of SLO software, not all of which are necessarily clear to people before they embark on the task of writing that software. Kind of a, yes, I will write a Twitter competitor over the weekend, I'm not too busy kind of thing. But I mean, that's kind of the case with more or less any business problem, that there's some question of how complicated it is versus the capabilities of your organization. But of course, also, what else could those engineers be doing versus working on implementing this particular thing, which is kind of the opportunity cost question. That tends to make its way into business discussions as, is this core to your business? Is doing SLO software something that you are going to noodle on, maybe to the exclusion of a bunch of other stuff, or in some sense going to be a core pillar to the things you do? Or is it something that actually at the end of the day, you would buy in? And for some folks, I suppose that discussion would end up on one side or the other side, depending. One analogy would be, do you like to buy your coffee from a vendor, or do you have your own coffee machine or something like that? Okay, fine. There's a bunch of other criteria as well. So I think business core is important. Also the question of scale and growth, because it's one thing to hack together a bunch of scripts for, okay, I've like 50 SLOs maybe, and that's probably within the scope of a for loop in Bash or like Python or something. Okay, fine. But if you have potentially a growing set of services and a growing set of data, the answer at one stage of your evolution might change at another stage of your evolution, and you have to keep that potential evolution in mind as well. And there's also kind of cost as well, because one of the interesting things about the build versus buy is that in most organizations, the costs of build are not fully articulated because they are seen mostly under the heading of software engineer salary rather than actual opportunity cost, as I said previously, or maintenance costs, which are hugely important and in some cases dominating over time, like they're the dominating term of what you do over time. But again, that depends on questions like surrounding growth and so on. So those are some of the factors that go in towards it.
Anybody want to add anything to that? Other factors that they think are really need to be top of mind when you're making this decision?
I can tack something on there. I'm kind of in a funny situation because on the one hand, I'm CTO of a software company that's selling, that would love our customers to buy the product, right? But on the other hand, I'm leading a team that's building one. So I myself am very much in the build camp for SLOs in particular. And I want to point out some of the things about an SLO product that maybe, if I had known what this would look like 5 years ago when we started this company, might have made me pause. One of those is the degree to which SLOs as a business practice, not calculating an SLO. I think I can paraphrase Troy, who said, anyone can calculate some nines, right? Anyone can divide two numbers and get a fraction of one. That part's not the hard part. I think I underestimated the degree to which SLOs are a service provided to the org that's using them, whether it's an infrastructure engineering org, platform engineering, broad community of application development, service owning teams. We're constantly going in to fix things or adapt to things. And I think it's important to look at what it takes to build something, and then also what it takes to run it. Also, kind of harking back to what Niall just said. That's a big piece of it. When your observability system goes down or there's some breakage or discontinuity in your data, how do you actually go in and repair it? And I've been consistently surprised at how much this is a service. This requires service, customer service, or sometimes data service, hosting of the SLOs versus simply the functionality to create them.
Yeah,
it's a real eye opener for me.
And I like that point too. And if I were to like overly summarize, I would say consider all factors, right? Not just the upfront, like build the tool, do the math. It's all these other things that you're hearing, like Alex and I both mentioned. It's a complete package when you have to make the evaluation. It's everything from the labor to do it, the infrastructure and resources to actually consume and build it, and then the support of it. And I think when you go back to the core of it, it's like, why are we doing this at all? It's, in the case of SLOs, it's to like measure service reliability and do that. It's more than just the math. It's like, are we going to actually achieve the outcome, and do you have the expertise to do that? And that's a lot of times, like if you have to consider, do you have that resource? Not even just building the software, like do we have somebody that knows the domain enough to evangelize it, to push it, to educate teams, to support teams, to help deal with nuanced edge cases and crazy data possibilities from source providers in this case? It's a full ecosystem to consider.
Yeah, and to that point too, like a lot of places are sort of lacking the discipline to have like what would be like an internal product for us kind of product management, right? Because you're committing to something that is going to be reliability for your production environment. That means it should hopefully be long-lived and take into account new and changing requirements based on the teams that you're onboarding to it and all these other things. And like having the discipline to treat your internal production tools as a product and product manage them effectively over time can be difficult, and some folks don't have the personnel to do that as well.
So when you do think about when you're in this situation of making a build versus buy decision, you're kicking off SLOs as this net new initiative. And I've heard stories, plenty of stories, just being at Noble 9 for less than a year about, well, we tried to do SLOs, but it didn't work, and we don't want to try it again. How much, I guess, how much is the build versus buy discussion almost driven by creating capacity, creating the ability to socialize and to get to encourage adoption of SLOs?
Well, that's a full-time job. I'll go ahead. Go ahead now.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt at all. After
I
you.
was gonna say like that is that goes back to like the outcome you're trying to achieve, right? It's not to build software, right? It's to use the software to achieve the means or an outcome. And as long as like you are thinking about how does that actually work, like in the case of SLOs, it's a big paradigm shift for people. Like in most enterprises you're looking at, and in companies you're saying like, is it working or not working? Well, like what about all the various degrees in between, right? And like that's what the metrics allow you to have. But in order to do that, it's a big shift. It's a cultural shift. It's a mindset shift for teams and to adopt. And you have to have a body of folks that are willing to go out there and help teach and get people on board.
Niall, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm kind of in the DevOps camp on this one, which is to say that there is a complex relationship between people, culture, and tooling, and especially in the context of, shall we say, an SLO implementation failure, you can often use new tools to kind of break people's previous historic assumption of failure or followed failure, if you see what I mean. And particularly if the tool comes from an outside place. I say that kind of with the vendor hat on, but also from the experience of being in a particular organization that failed to do X, and we bought an external tool to do X. And as it happens, we failed in a different way, but the conversations changed such that the organization came to understand that it was actually not necessarily their failure or kind of a basic competence question, but was more kind of situational. And in fact, the situation changed later on, and the tooling helped to kind of unlock people's mindset around things. So it can be a useful tactic when you're thinking about implementing, even if it doesn't actually end up solving the bulk of the problem.
Interesting.
And I think there too, there's a bit of a potential carrot and stick model that changes a little bit if you have bought something. You've signed a contract, you've bought seats, you have some kind of impetus to ensure that those seats are being used since you're paying for them, right? Or if not,
Yeah.
then you're going to cancel the whole project, maybe and cancel the whole contract, right? Or not renew it. So there is a certain amount of timeliness that comes into a purchase that folks don't necessarily feel when it's just, oh, well, the guy in next cube writes this, and whenever we get to it, we get to it. And it's not maybe the same amount of urgency that comes into it, rather than, oh, we bought this thing, we paid for it, we better use it.
Yeah. Is to my mind, I feel like when you're talking about SLOs, because they are still somewhat of an unknown for a lot of organizations, you know you need them, but you don't necessarily know what they should look like. How big of a challenge is it when building out an SLO feature to define what it should look like and what it should do and how it should be kind of engaged with?
It's really
I
hard.
have a comment. I have a comment on this one. Look, we see this a lot because often Noble 9 is brought into, let's say, a proof of concept or a trial where a group has been working with SLOs using some other product or often their own internal tooling or their own internal mechanism for calculating. And one of the things I see over and over again is one of the things that can be challenging is if you're doing a custom build or if you're trying to start small, one of the things you're going to try to do is constrain the scope of what it is that you put in place, whatever features you're going to build. So you might say like, oh, I'm only going to use 1 or 2 data sources and I'm going to ignore all the other, 5 or a dozen other data sources, maybe some custom stuff. You might constrain the capabilities. You might say, well, I'm going to make all of my SLOs time-based, like count good minutes versus bad minutes, or make them all occurrences-based, which is sort of the straight ratio of good events versus bad events. You might make them all calendar aligned, like month by month, and not recognizing the fact that maybe some teams want a 2-week rolling SLO or a quarter-long rolling SLO, or whatever it is. And I think it's a good, valuable trick that if you can constrain the complexity and pick a smaller scope, you can make it work. But eventually that could hit some kind of a limitation. That's one of the challenges that I significantly see when people get started. And I would say I felt this over the years. Like if I had realized the breadth of features you need just in the math, that's just in the basic calculating the nines kind of thing, dealing with missing data, dealing with sparse data, dealing with extremely frequent data, trying to find the right way to aggregate it or histogram it to get a calculation that makes sense for what those service owners are looking for. If I had realized the complexity at first, I might have run away screaming. But we at the same time, we do see a lot of teams successful with SLOs, and then if they come to us, they know what they're looking for. That it does serve to kind of crystallize what those requirements really are, because they've tried to actually put it into play. And I think that's the other important consideration is it's important to get started to clarify those requirements, especially with something as empirical, pragmatic as SLOs, right? There's a big difference between the theory and actually then calculating the SLO. And oh no, one of our data sources is just down or changed last month, and how do we roll with that, right? That's what you discover along the journey.
Yeah, I agree. I think like when you think about like SLOs in particular, it's not that it's like an unknown or not really well defined like body of knowledge or domain, but like people have been measuring success rate and putting targets on it for a long time, right? There's no like groundbreaking thing there. But when you start looking at how systems have success rates and what are we measuring success rate of, and like you mentioned, all these nuanced things. Part of the benefit though of like a build solution is that you have the opportunity to actually learn something, like the saying of like you learn more by doing. Like it, you can read a million books, you can really, but when you start building your own, you really start understanding the math and what's the difference between rolling versus not, and calendar versus not, and what about exclusion windows, and what about outage windows. Like these all become things that you learn about and have to build yourself to understand. And I think what you alluded to is you have a lot of customers that come to you and say, oh, well, like we know exactly what we want now, and does it do this thing or not? And it does, right? I think the what this is alluding to, and we talked about this before, and one of our things is that it's not a permanent decision either, right? Like you can very well proof of concept and do a lot of R&D and start building your own stuff to like see it out and test things out, to learn and to educate yourselves, and then buy, right? Like that's always a model. It's not a finite thing. Or inversely, you could use a vendor to get you bootstrapped and understand the domain, and then say, well, we actually know enough about it, and we have enough nuance that in particular stuff for us that's proprietary that the vendor's never going to make. Therefore, we can build our own solution too. So there's many avenues and ways this could roll out.
So I kind of want to go to each of you for a moment and just ask you your own experience in implementing SLOs, when you made or were involved in a build versus buy discussion. What were you looking for? What were the deciding factors? And do you stick by your decision, or do you think you would have done it another way? I'll start with Mandy.
And I was going to say, oh, we should have invited our staff SRE to this discussion because they were the ones who sort of put this together for us. And we are Noble 9 customers now, and these things are starting to roll out internally. And yeah, like we have our own engineers in service to our product, right? That is what we need them to be doing. And where we need those precious, expensive resources to be working is on new features for our customers and focused on that. And we do buy a lot of other products that some places might do a little bit more of their own homegrown things. We do have some homegrown stuff that has been around a very long time. When the team was smaller, the product was smaller, the customer base was maybe not as demanding as some of our customers are now. But as the company matures and you get to the point where you're a public company, there are things that we need to be doing in service to our customers rather than things that we'd like to build cool stuff internally that isn't really in service to our product. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now with a lot of our tooling.
Niall, how about yourself?
So you must understand that prior to my most recent startup journey, I spent the bulk of my professional career in Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, all of whom, without exception, never saw a line of code they didn't want to rewrite.
Yeah.
So when you say, well, actually, I'll change my position a little bit. Amazon did actually buy some software and had a very proud ethos around the there shall be nothing except RPC diktat that folks were very ideological is kind of the wrong word, but ideological about being able to put some different implementation behind an RPC layer of whatever kind. So, but I think it definitely holds for Google and Microsoft. And so you will be unsurprised to hear that the SLO repository software in Google, which I think actually, if I recall correctly, a long while ago originated in my org, or at least one bit of it did. And then the Microsoft situation was they have a tool, internally facing tool, that helps to manage all of the Azure services, and it's kind of a classic corporate scorecard kind of management tool. So every service gets assessed under a bunch of headings, and they added SLOs as one of those headings. And so everyone had to put their SLO in a specific place and report their SLO according to that performance and so on. So relentlessly build, folks, is where the bulk of my history is.
Troy, I know you've got an interesting story around this too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that have come into like my analysis and just the situation you're in. I think, when I was at a telecom a long time ago, well, feels like a long time ago, I guess it wasn't that long ago. You look at some of the stuff that, and this is kind of a full circle moment for what Niall mentioned, but look, what kind of staff do you have? Like who can build this? And when you're looking at a vendor solution, you're saying, well, like can it meet our particular needs? And typically what I found is that you think you're unique and you think we have all these like crazy things that are proprietary to yourself, and then you find out like maybe we shouldn't be doing that, maybe that's the problem, and then you try to evaluate. So but I think it's like when you start making the decision to really understand what you're trying to solve first before you even do a build buy versus conversation. It's like what are we trying to solve with the thing we're trying to build or buy? Because you have to either write requirements to build it yourself, or you have to have some sort of requirements that you're measuring if you're doing an RFP or something like that to get a product evaluation done, right? So like I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is like it really depends on the situation you're in at the time and who's around you and what you have to build. And maybe there's already something there that gives you a new opportunity or an edge that's an existing bit of software that you can build on top of. Or like in the example now mentioned, if you're building and you have an existing scorecard mechanism, like the example he just mentioned, where plugging SLOs into it is really just the right thing to do. Maybe you can use a vendor tool to do the engine and then port the data into something else. Or maybe it makes sense to build it yourself because you already have a foundation of good software, quality software that's there. I think that's it's pretty varied. In my experience has been that, exactly that, varied.
That's interesting. Now, you said something interesting there, Troy, about kind of bringing in a vendor to be an engine to something that you build yourself. So, I mean, to that point, the build versus buy is not a purely binary decision. You know, I know that at Noble Nine, we've got clients who purchase us for certain features and then use those features to feed their own internally built tools.
Yeah, I think that's I'm glad you called that out, because I mentioned earlier like how it's not one or the other. It could be both at some point in your journey, but it also could be both the whole time, right? There's very well you could build around the tool or leverage its core strength. I think when you're looking in like at different solutions that are out there, right? Maybe there's a bundled offering and they have 20 things that they offer, but you really only need like one part of that thing. One is, can you only purchase that one thing and not have to pay for the whole thing that you're not going to use? But also, can you just use it behind the scenes of your system? At Microsoft, could they have used the example that Niall used? Could they have used Noble 9 as the engine to compute the SLOs and ingest the data into that calculation and stuff, and then put that and read that API out and put it on a scorecard? Why not, right? I mean, that it really, again, it comes back to what you're trying to accomplish, and maybe that saves a lot of your labor costs. The hard part, the stuff that Alex mentioned, all the math and stuff that you guys do.
And that,
Yeah.
we've had a lot of mentions of, I think all of you at one point have talked about maintenance of a build. So it's not like you build it and you're done. So how much would you say kind of the investment in building versus buying, or well, not versus buying, in building is that initial, scoping and building out, creating the software itself, and how much of it is the maintenance and the continued evolution of your kind of in-house built SLO solution? Yeah, Niall.
Yeah, so the generic answer to this is, of course, that the long-term costs of maintenance for software are completely dominant over the short-term costs. Something like, and I mean, of course, one of the issues with actually coming up with a number for this is evidence-based software engineering is a terrible, terrible field, and like no one has any idea what the actual numbers are, and measurement is hard, and all of those kind of caveats. But basically, if anything lasts for a decent enough time, basically the startup costs go to 10%, maybe zero, and maintenance cost is 90%. Now, maybe that overall cost is quite low if it's a bunch of hacked together scripts or whatever. Or conversely, maybe the maintenance costs are quite high if it's a bunch of hacked together stuff. And it's like there are so many variables. It's hard to come up with a definitive answer. But the short one is, if it lasts any decent duration of time, or if it's in any way important, you'll want to keep it alive under conditions of changing scale, APIs, cloud providers, like all of the stuff that's happening. Maybe you'll shove generative AI in there somewhere. I don't know. But broadly speaking, the maintenance cost will come to dominate any other thing. And most people make build versus buy decisions on the complement set of the maintenance cost.
I have numbers on this because that's what our software does. I would say, look, at a high level, there's really three categories of spend. Okay. There's feature development, which could be initial, but it also could be ongoing. And then there's like what it costs to run it. So, pay for the infrastructure to run it, do the support, which is both sort of like operations support, but also customer support. And then there's what I'll call the math aspect, which I think is its own category, partly because we see not only that it's more nuanced than it appears on the surface, but also questions come up. As soon as you put this thing in the line of fire of a management review, an executive review, maybe customer facing, depending on your use case, you're going to have questions. Some 75 or 80% of customer support situations aren't, what's the right setting? How do I do this? My data doesn't seem to match. Why? And it usually does somehow match, but requires explanation and investigation, or sometimes it doesn't match and has to be fixed. And that's really where the nuance comes in. Now, when you break them down, you said like how much of it is maintenance. I would include sort of like what it costs to run it, as well as what it costs to sort of maintain and support it. I think it's, by my measurement, it may not be up to the 90% that Niall was saying, but it's over half. Okay. It's over half of the total cost. Keeping something running, that's probably going to have to be, if you're measuring systems that have 3 nines, 4 nines, maybe even more than that of reliability, this thing has to be that accurate. It has to be up all the time. If you're using it for alerting, it's your alerting mechanism. It's going to have to wake people up when everything else goes down. So it has to have some independence in hosting. It's really not trivial, I think a lot of times we like to focus on the product features, high level categories of product features. You got to get data into it from all the relevant places. You have to make a bunch of pretty charts and reports that are kind of might have to be tweaked and customized to the audience. And you have a couple different audiences, like your overnight incident responders versus your executive team or your product team or something like that. You might have to export the data somewhere. You have to be able to like leave yourself notes on what happened back then, maybe repair the data somewhere in the past. You might have to restate an SLO. At some point, someone might ask you to go and backfill correct data if there was an inaccuracy of data, or do what if type of analysis and compare versions between things. You might have permissioning issues and sort of like this whole role-based access control regime to build into the thing. And it just all that stuff just gets really complex really quickly. And a lot of it doesn't really have to do with the core of measuring reliability. Like if you're kind of shuffling around what your permissions are and can I do a group sync back to my Active Directory or whatever the thing is you're working on, it's not really core to the SLO problem or the reliability question, right? And I think more than half of it falls into that sort of maintenance category by my current assessment of where we are 5 years in. That's my hunch.
Now, in your experience, when an organization starts thinking about SLOs as a strategy, how near term do they feel that this needs to be? Like, how fast do they want to go from, okay, we've decided that SLOs need to be, a core component of our reliability strategy, to why aren't my SLOs up and running and giving me business value?
Immediate. They want it yesterday. It's like with anything, right? Like you want it, and then all of a sudden it's like the priority. I think SLOs in particular, it really depends on the current state of things. How are you measuring reliability today? Are you using incident counts as a measure? Are you using MTTR? Like what is your current strategy, right or wrong, right? And how much different is it when you know to a 1/10 of a percentage how many failures you had versus before, right? Where you didn't. Like it's a very I think that the simplicity of what it is, you'd think it doesn't have such a big impact or could take so much time to adopt and actually mechanize and use, but it's an astronomical investment to switch over to using them consistently if you weren't born using them, right? Smaller, newer, modern startups, companies have the opportunity to start by measuring those things. But a lot of times they don't even do it because they're compromising that for speed. So they're not really, there's like, is it working? It's still up. Let's keep going, add more features, right? But it's a huge investment. I think the expectation is that it's a quick and easy thing. And the reality is that it's not. And that's why when you go into the discussion of build versus buy, it's like, consider not just the tool, consider the resources to make it of acting practice and to use the data that the tool is outputting.
We've got some questions coming in from the audience. Kip Malone asks, what are some strategies for driving SLOs with application owners that do not have strong opinions of how their applications operate? I.e., what does good look like?
Meh, 3
And
nines,
I'm
move
just
on.
yeah. I'm just typing some ideas in there that come up, about sort of like identifying who the users are, so you can figure out what it is that they need and sort of revisit. And then starting with the basics, like measuring, is it down? Is it slow? Like basic, does the car start? Can it drive kind of stuff? And then also drawing them out in a workshop format. If you often, when organizations are going about this, they'll start with either some central team or someone close to a central team who owns the tooling maybe, or owns the observability stack, et cetera, or the platform, and kind of work out from there. And yet the 100th user or the 1,000th user in that company is dealing with the same situation, which is like, yeah, I guess I was named the service owner for this application. Is it actually working? What does it do? It's still kind of like this very fundamental question for many application development service owners to ask, what is this application actually supposed to do? Okay. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is identifying what are the people or other systems that are dependent on that service, and starting measuring some basics and kind of working out from there. The other thing I'll mention, and this is important and it is kind of relevant to the build versus buy, is SLOs are not sort of a one and done thing where it's like, oh, I created my SLO. Okay, well, I'm done. I'll just go back to my other work. Like, to a certain extent, that's true. The SLO is going to run and kind of monitor the end result of how you're actually doing, but you have to revisit that on a regular basis. And you want your tooling to also support that capability that, like, okay, well, maybe we should look at this in our weekly review or our sprint review every 2 weeks or on a monthly basis with our management or with our stakeholders. Let's get in place something that looks at that. And that comes down to, I think, 2 forms of review. The one is looking at the SLOs themselves and saying, well, okay, this thing's completely green all the time. Like, it's not telling us anything. It's just a green dial tone. All it tells us is that it's up. But we know it wasn't actually, there were issues. Why weren't they caught? And expand from there. And the other piece is including it in your incident retros. Anytime that you have, let's say, an incident where the system goes down, maybe a botch release and a rollback, that sort of thing, it's helpful to go back and look at the SLOs and make sure that, okay, we did have an outage there. It cost us something. Did the SLO actually turn red? If it did, how much? How much error budget did we burn? Do we have it configured that there's the right amount of error budget? You need to be able to adjust the thing, ideally even backstate it and say, okay, well, it looks like we set a goal that was too high and it was too tight. Maybe we want to dial that down a little bit, but let's go back and get a month of history and rerun it as if, we had made that decision a month ago and see what the incident looked like. Oh, look, it burned about half of our budget. And the team that is the users of the system is kind of half angry. Okay, it's about right, and kind of enable that conversation.
Niall's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just while Alex was talking about history there, I remembered that I wrote a short piece on implicit SLOs a while ago. And one of the things that is an answer to how do you drive SLOs with application owners that don't have strong opinions? One of the answers is, well, you have already been doing something for some time if the application is not newly created or launched, right? You have been offering service and you measure how it's been performing and you set the SLO to that. And at least then you won't be wildly in conflict with the existing behavior today.
With reality.
Exactly. And the piece goes into some detail about what happens if your SLO is at a wild variation with your kind of historical performance and the kind of weirdnesses that can create. But I would definitely recommend measuring the historical performance if there is in fact a historical performance, and if it's new, well, that's an opportunity to reflect on a number of larger issues.
Yeah,
Alex,
I totally agree with that. I mean, that strategy in some places, I've read that there's like, don't base it on that, but because you want people to probe deeper and like find out what is the customer impact really if it's 3 nines versus 2 nines. And I think the struggle with that is in reality that doesn't pan out. And it's more like what Niall was mentioning is like, look, the world's not on fire today, hopefully, knock on wood. Where are we at? Like, how are we doing? Right. And then put your error budget put your objective that leaves you with an error budget that's 50% or something, or somewhere where it's going to be used, right? You don't want to put it so low that it's pegged at 100, and you don't want to put it at so high that it's negative 10 million, but like make sure it's in use based on some recent historic traffic and do it. I do go back to what Alex was mentioning a bit on like understanding your customer. I think like if I look at the question, it's like application owners do not have a strong opinion. A lot of it is you have to remember the incentive structure here. Like, is your organization, are teams incentivized to meet objectives for their application performance, or is the bar that it's working or it's not working? Like, as long as it's working, everyone's happy, right? And that is what we talked about Ruby before. Is like how long it takes to how long it can take to like adopt like SLOs and use those. There's a lot of change in that, right? If the incentive structures aren't in place, that requires a lot of change to your team.
When I think there too, like if your customers aren't telling you that they are expecting better performance out of the things that you're serving them, like maybe that's a thing you deprioritize. Like you're going to spend a lot of resources to build this out, attach the SLOs, making sure you're getting all of the right data and it's all coming in and it's all flowing correctly, and you're going to alert people on it and all these things. But if your customers are telling you, meh, don't really care one way or the other, and that's reflected in how the application owners and maybe even the product owners kind of treat it, like maybe you're putting those resources in the wrong place. Maybe there's something else you could be doing with that stuff, or other things you could be prioritizing if it really isn't something that's important to your customers. And that's a lot of insight that maybe teams have and maybe teams don't have. Like we see a lot of over prioritization of certain services that maybe aren't your tier 1s or tier 2 kind of services, that you're getting people up in the middle of the night for something that people only use during the day and things like that.
There's
another question.
Let me just tack one thing on there, which is we see people who have a lot of different kinds of SLOs. And some of the SLOs are like experimental, like someone decided to create something because they release a new service and they want to see how it works. And, maybe it's red all the time, maybe it's green all the time, because they may not have hit it right on the nose. But there are other SLOs. The dream of how this works for this service owner, right, is that they find something to measure which does map pretty well to what the customer or consuming system needs. And once they do that, if you have a way in your tooling, your reporting, your review cycle, whatever, to nominate or sort of anoint those SLOs as the real ones, the sort of production SLOs, these are the ones we're actually going to watch. Now you have this advantage, which is, you have a way of sort of marking that, this is one of the ones that really matter. It's sort of like our golden SLO. We're gonna defend that. We're gonna protect that. That's what gets you over that hump. But it's back and forth between the stakeholders and the service owners.
Great. Thank you, Alex. We got another question. Pranita Naik asks, how frequently would you recommend reviewing the SLOs, and what factors can we consider to decide if and when a review is needed? I'll ask Mandy that question.
I think this is super interesting, and from our side, like, it's probably something you want to talk about in an incident review, but also from a software delivery lifecycle kind of thing, it's probably something you want to look at when you're adding a lot more features to the service that you're working on as well. Is you're now maybe have different customer behaviors, you have different user expectations, you've added a whole bunch of new things onto this. So, like, probably not weekly, but definitely more than once a year, whatever your development sort of cycle is and the behavior of that system in production. So I would weigh somewhere between, if you've had a major outage, definitely look at it then. If you've done a significant amount of work or some periodic number of sprints, look at it then, maybe quarterly if you don't have that kind of, rigor around the sort of things. But like we mentioned earlier, these should be living sort of documents or living sort of metrics that you are constantly making sure they're in service to your actual goals. And if they're no longer working for you, then being able to change them. So if you come to a place where they're no longer working for you after a major incident or after some feature releases, then it's time to clean out or put something different in.
Niall, what do you got to say?
Yeah, just super quickly, let's distinguish between conformance and specification. So you should review your SLO conformance essentially continually, or, at least in your production meetings weekly or whatever. You should review the specification either on an event triggered basis, i.e., turns out the system has had blah outages and blah amount of time, and maybe this SLO is unsuitable for various reasons, or kind of periodically, quarterly, 6-monthly, yearly, or kind of ranges I have seen. So just be careful about those distinctions.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to use that. We're using that in probably an hour. But yeah, that's such a true point. Like, how is it looking at how it's doing? You should probably more often, I would say, like, it doesn't take much to glance at your SLO and see its performance. And are we, and Manny made a good point, like during your releases, like, hey, let's observe it and see if the change caused something. But to your point, Al, like, are we measuring the right thing still? A lot's happened in the past 6 months. Like, maybe we should add an SLO for that new page that we did in its load time or something, or maybe we should measure the availability of that new service or API we offer. Like that's some stuff that it's a very different thing you're trying to do. So I like that call out on those two.
I have one thing to tack on. I did an informal survey a while back about what makes systems go down. And the top answer, not that unexpected, was it's because we're working on them. We're doing construction. We're making changes. We're upgrading, we're replatforming, we're migrating, or we're simply releasing features. That's what makes this stuff go down. And so one of the important times to review is before you make a change, especially if that change could risk the one job or the multiple jobs that service is supposed to do, and then also after, right? And then certainly you want to have a conversation when an SLO, when there's a burn event. Certainly if you run out of error budget, at the very least, this should be triggering a conversation. People should be looking at it, set an alert on the thing. Create yourself a JIRA ticket, basically. Somebody should be looking at it.
We got another question from the audience. Diego Souza asks, what points make the adoption of SLOs a challenge? And what strategies can we use as a company that is starting to implement digital transformation?
I could take a crack at that one. So some of the stuff we've mentioned are challenges. I would say, like, the incentives of people, like the fact that the metric needs to be used, right? Like, some challenges I've seen in the past have been, we measure the availability of a thing, and then it's just another measure. It's just a metric. It's just a thing. It's just there, and not using it, and then having a plan for what you're going to do once you measure it, right? Like a lot of people, because things are working or not working, they live in that kind of world. If it's working, they don't know how well it's working. And then when you say, oh, it's actually 99% or 98.4%, and you're like, it's failing a percent or more of the time, they're like, no way, no possible way. We want to be 5 nines. We want to be available. And then this conflict arises that you have to be prepared for, which is like, actually, it's not. And here's the data that tells you it's not. And that becomes a really big challenge to overcome. I think like the incentivization and incentive structure, it's like been the thing I've learned this year the most is like, everybody's driven by incentives. Like that's what it is. We come to work every day to get paid to do our job, right? But like if I come to work every day and I'm not incentivized to have a good performance and application performance of my thing, then there's no reason to. So like making sure people that do really well with their SLO adoption and like show that they've made, they started at 98% and they've improved it a percentage point because they've made investments to resilience and whatnot. That's a great thing to celebrate and make sure you raise spirits to get people to want to follow suit. But making sure just people have the right incentives is a big challenge. And usually that requires you need kind of that cross-cutting kind of approach where you're gonna work with engineers to teach them the value of knowing where they can find problems in their systems, and you're going to want to work with leadership to say it's a tool, and Mandy said it the best, it's a resourcing tool for them to know where to spend their time and their money and their effort and their teams. You got an organization of a bunch of people, where should you put your people? Not the thing that's just loud, it's the thing that actually empirically needs the most help. So you want to show them all of the magical tools you're going to give them, but both the top and the bottom, so it kind of converges and everyone's on the same page.
Right. Well, we've only got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to go around around the group and ask you to fill in the blank. You should probably build if X. You should probably buy if Y. I'm going to start with Niall on this one.
Sure. You should probably build if you're Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. Or if you have sufficient software engineering expertise in-house, or if blah, 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 blah. And you should probably buy if you're the complement set of that. Yep.
Alex.
I would say you should probably build if your company, your organization really doesn't buy things. There's sort of like a cultural, maybe it has to do with security or it has to do with the capabilities of the org, but there are some companies that really just bristle at bringing in third-party stuff. That is probably a longer term conversation, but that's one situation where I think you should consider building. You should probably buy if you want to get results fast. The hole is a bigger hole to dig than I thought it was. If you want to get results fast, bring something in, see if it works.
Mandy?
Yeah, you should probably build if you want to compete with Noble 9. I mean, it's
that.
we don't want anybody to do that because it's an amazing product anyway. But yeah, for most cases, buying is going to get you the way where you want to be faster than you are going to get there if you try and build it yourself.
Roy?
I'm going to be difficult. You should probably build if your evaluation tells you should, and you should probably buy if your evaluation tells you should. And really all the factors that were brought up today from the group here, I think you should consider, and that make that full educated, guess on where you go, and don't feel too concerned if you made the right or wrong decision, because I think what we've talked about here plenty of times is that you can change, and you can adopt, and it might not be one or the other. It might be both.
And last thing, I have a special question for Troy. When we first met in, I think it was March or February, I asked you what it was like building an SLO platform internally, and you answered me with a single word. Do you remember what that word was?
Pain.
Yeah, pain.
It is. It is. Alex will probably use the similar
I
words.
agree with you. I agree with you.
Who thought that simple division would be so hard?
Who knew?
Division at scale. Yeah.
Yes. Dude, that could be an SRE talk. SRECon talk.
There you go.
Division at scale.
Papers are probably open soon. Yeah.
Yeah,
They have
they're
up until November 1st, I think. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mandy, Niall, Alex, Troy, all of you. This has been a fascinating and enjoyable conversation. I really want to thank you for your time. If you can hear the construction happening in the room behind me, I apologize. They just decided to do that starting during the discussion, apparently. To everybody who joined us today, thank you for attending. And I hope that this has been valuable. Anybody want to say one last thing before we head out? Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of your days.